Step away from the luxury vehicle, ma'am. We need to verify you actually live here.
Excuse me, this is my driveway. Who are you people?
Don't start with the attitude. You fit the description, so just comply.
I am a sitting congresswoman. I'm not showing you anything without a warrant.
I don't care who you think you are. ID now or you're in cuffs.
The humidity in Atlanta that late October afternoon was a physical presence, a heavy, wet blanket that pressed against the windshield of Nia Donovan's hybrid SUV. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt, distorting the world at the edges of her vision. Nia sat in the driver's seat, the climate control humming a soft, artificial breeze against her face, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel tighter than necessary. She had just turned off the main thoroughfare and navigated the winding tree-lined streets of the Millstone townhouse complex in Buckhead. The silence inside the cabin was a desperate commodity. For the last 10 days, Nia's life had been a cacophony of town halls, committee markups, shouting constituents, and the relentless drone of airport announcements. As the representative for her district, she lived her life in public. Her every expression calibrated her tone, constantly moderated, to avoid the pitfalls of being labeled emotional or aggressive. The drive home was usually her decompression chamber, 20 minutes of jazz playlist and solitude before she stepped back into the role of wife, mother, and neighbor. She checked the dashboard clock, 5:17 p.m. She was late, but not disastrously so. In the trunk, 3 bags of groceries shifted slightly as she turned the wheel milk fresh kale, a carton of eggs, and a pint of mint chocolate chip ice cream that was fighting a losing battle against the Georgia heat. She had promised Marcus she would handle dinner tonight. It was a small domestic anchor, a way to prove that the job hadn't swallowed her whole. Nia pressed the button on her visor, and the wrought iron gate to her specific cluster of townhomes groaned open. It was slow, agonizingly slow, a mechanical sluggishness that usually annoyed her, but today felt rhythmic, almost hypnotic. She waved instinctively at the security camera mounted on the brick pillar, a habit born of years of hypervisibility. She pulled through the tires, crunching softly on the decorative paved concrete that marked the upscale nature of the community. Her driveway was steep, a short incline leading up to a garage tucked beneath the main living level of the narrow 3-story brick townhouse. She maneuvered the SUV up the slope, the engine whining slightly, and put it in park. The silence that followed the engine cutting out was absolute. For a moment, Nia just sat there. She closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she felt she had been holding since she left D.C. that morning. Home, sanctuary. She unbuckled her seatbelt, the sharp zip click of the retraction signaling the end of the shift. She reached for her purse on the passenger seat, her mind already moving to the logistics of getting the groceries inside before the ice cream turned to soup. She opened the driver's side door, swinging her legs out. Her heels hit the pavement with a solid clack. That was when the light changed. A shadow swept over her, blocking out the low afternoon sun. A dark sedan, completely unmarked, had pulled into the driveway directly behind her SUV. It was so close that the front bumper was mere inches from her rear sensors. She hadn't heard it approach. They must have tailgated her through the gate before it closed, timing the move with predatory precision. Nia froze. Her hand was still on the door handle, her body half turned out of the vehicle. The adrenaline dump was instantaneous, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with survival. She was boxed in. If she tried to back up, she would hit them. If she ran forward, she was cornered in her own garage. 2 men were already exiting the sedan. They moved with a synchronized aggression that screamed law enforcement, yet they wore no uniforms. They were dressed in plain clothes, jeans, tight t-shirts, tactical vests with no visible agency patches, and aggressive wraparound sunglasses. The man in the lead was Roman Vaughn. He was a wall of a man thick-necked with a buzz cut that showed the pale skin of his scalp. He didn't walk, he encroached. He moved up the driveway with a speed that was entirely unnecessary for a suburban encounter, his right hand hovering near his waist, dangerously close to a holster that was partially concealed by his vest. "Step away from the vehicle," Vaughn barked. His voice was a gravelly shout that bounced off the brick walls of the townhouses, shattering the quiet of the neighborhood. Nia didn't move. Her training not as a politician, but as a black woman who had grown up in neighborhoods where unmarked cars meant trouble kicked in. Do not make sudden movements. Do not reach for anything. Do not run. "Excuse me." Nia's voice was steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Who are you?" Vaughn ignored the question. He continued his advance, closing the distance until he was standing just beyond the swing of her car door, effectively trapping her between the vehicle and his body. His partner, a younger man named Carter, who looked nervous, but determined to mimic Vaughn's bravado, drifted toward the passenger side, peering through the tinted windows with blatant suspicion. I said, "Step away from the vehicle, ma'am," Vaughn repeated louder this time. "We need to verify the registration and your authorization to be in possession of this car." The words took a second to process. Authorization to be in possession? They weren't asking if she lived here. They weren't asking if she had seen anything suspicious. They were accusing her in her own driveway of stealing her own car. Nia straightened her spine, pulling herself up to her full height. She was wearing a blazer and slacks, her congressional pin currently in her purse. But even without the symbols of her office, she radiated a dignity that Vaughn seemed determined to crush. "This is my vehicle," Nia said, her tone dropping an octave, becoming the voice she used when a committee hearing was spiraling out of control. "And this is my driveway. You are trespassing on private property. I asked you a question. Who are you?" Vaughn scoffed a short, sharp sound of dismissal that was more insulting than a slap. He hooked his thumbs into his vest, leaning back slightly in a posture of arrogant authority. "Federal agents, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, were conducting an operation in the area regarding high-value asset trafficking and identity fraud. You match the description of a suspect we're tracking." "What description?" Nia asked, her eyes narrowing. "A black woman in a luxury SUV in Atlanta. Do you have any idea how broad that is?" "Don't start with the attitude," Vaughn snapped, pointing a finger at her face. The gesture was aggressive, designed to provoke a reaction. "I don't care about your commentary. I care about seeing some identification that proves you didn't just boost this ride from the airport." The attitude. The phrase hung in the humid air like a toxic cloud. It was the trap Nia had navigated her entire career. If she got angry, if she raised her voice, if she showed a single crack in her professional veneer, she became the angry black woman. She became a threat. She became justification for whatever force Vaughn wanted to use. This was the reputation trap, the moment where a victim's reasonable reaction to abuse is weaponized to paint them as difficult or unprofessional. Nia forced herself to take a slow, shallow breath. She could feel the heat radiating from the asphalt, could smell the exhaust fumes from their idling sedan. "I am not giving you attitude, agent," she said, enunciating every syllable with crisp precision. "I am asserting my constitutional rights in my home. You have entered private property without a warrant. You have blocked my egress. You are demanding papers without articulating a reasonable suspicion of a crime." Vaughn stepped closer, invading her personal space. She could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You want to talk law school, or do you want to stay out of handcuffs because right now you're failing the cooperation test? I need to see a license and proof of residence. Now." "I am a sitting member of the United States Congress," Nia said. She didn't shout it. She stated it as a fact, a piece of data that should have ended the encounter immediately. "My identification is in the vehicle. If I reach for it, are you going to interpret that as a threat?" Vaughn laughed. It was a cold, incredulous sound. He looked back at Carter, shaking his head. "Did you hear that she's a congresswoman? Yeah, and I'm the Secretary of State. Look, lady, the do you know who I am routine doesn't work on us. We have a job to do. Get the ID. I am telling you who I am, so you understand the gravity of the mistake you are making," Nia said, her eyes locking onto his. "If you touch me, if you detain me unlawfully, there will be consequences." "Is that a threat?" Vaughn's hand dropped closer to his belt. The air in the driveway seemed to vanish. "Are you threatening a federal agent?" "I am informing you of the law," Nia said. The standoff was broken by the sound of water hitting concrete. "Hey, what's going on here?" Nia flicked her eyes to the left, careful not to turn her head completely. It was David Henderson, her neighbor from 3 doors down. David was a retired actuary, a man of precise habits, who watered his hydrangeas at 5:30 p.m. sharp every day. He was standing at the edge of his own lawn, the green garden hose in his hand, dripping water onto his driveway. He looked confused, his brow furrowed beneath his sun hat. "Go back inside, sir," Vaughn yelled without turning his head, his focus entirely on Nia. "Federal operation. Clear the area." But David didn't leave. He was a man who had spent 40 years analyzing risk, and something about this equation didn't look right. He turned off the nozzle of his hose and dropped it onto the grass. He walked toward the property line, his steps slow but deliberate. "This is private property," David said, his voice rising slightly. "That's Miss Donovan. She lives here. I've known her for 6 years. Why are you blocking her in—" "I said back off." Vaughn turned, then stepping toward David with an aggressive lunge that made the older man flinch but not retreat. This was the spark. In a neighborhood like this, sound carried. The shouting had drawn attention. Across the street, a garage door began to rise. 2 doors down, a second-floor window slid up. The silence of the suburb was fracturing. David, stay back, Nia called out, fear spiking in her chest. She didn't want him hurt. Please just record this. Do you have your phone? I'm already on it, Nia, a voice came from above. Nia looked up, squinting against the sun. It was Sarah, a young graphic designer who lived in the unit directly overlooking Nia's driveway. Sarah was leaning over her balcony railing, her smartphone held steady in both hands. I see them, Nia, Sarah shouted down. I'm streaming it to the cloud. I've got their faces. The lens of Sarah's phone, held steady with a timestamp ticking in the corner of the screen, captured the entire tableau from a high angle. The blocked driveway, the aggressive posture of the agents, and Nia standing alone by her door, her blazer contrasting with the tactical gear of the men surrounding her. Vaughn looked up, realizing they were being filmed. For a split second, his face faltered. The visual evidence was the enemy of the bully, but then his ego kicked in. He couldn't back down now, not in front of the rookie, not in front of the suspect, not when his authority was being challenged by a woman and her neighbors. Fine, Vaughn sneered, turning back to Nia with renewed hostility. You want an audience? We'll give them a show. Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle. You are being detained for obstruction of justice and failure to comply with a lawful order. I have not obstructed anything, Nia said, her voice shaking slightly now. I asked for a warrant. Do you have a warrant? I don't need a warrant to investigate a felony stop in progress, Vaughn lied. It was a bluff, a weak one, but he was banking on force carrying the day. He reached for her arm. Do not touch me, Nia recoiled, pulling her arm back. That's it, Vaughn growled. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metallic ratchet sound as he prepped them was loud in the small space. Nia knew she had seconds. She reached into her purse, her fingers fumbling for her phone. She needed to call Marcus. She needed to call the chief. She needed a witness on the line. She tapped the speed dial. The phone screen lit up, but as she held it to her ear, there was nothing. No ringtone, no connection. She stared at the screen in horror. No service. The driveway dipped down below the street level, creating a known dead zone for her carrier. Usually, the Wi-Fi from the house extended this far, but today, for some reason, a router glitch. A power surge, simple bad luck. Her phone wasn't connecting to the network. She was electronically isolated. This was the first imperfection, a technical failure that nearly cost her everything. Vaughn saw her look at the phone. He saw the panic in her eyes. He misinterpreted it instantly. She's calling for backup, Vaughn shouted to Carter. Secure her. Vaughn lunged. He didn't just reach this time. He grabbed. His heavy hand clamped onto Nia's wrist, his grip bruisingly tight. He yanked her forward, spinning her toward the car. Get off me! Nia screamed the dignity of the Congresswoman, vanishing beneath the terrified reaction of the assault survivor. She struggled, her heels scraping against the concrete, trying to keep her balance. Stop resisting, Vaughn roared, twisting her arm behind her back. Hey, get your hands off her. The shout didn't come from David or Sarah. It came from the street. Mr. Alcott, the property manager, had arrived. He was a man who lived for the Homeowners Association, rules a stickler, who measured grass height with a ruler. But today, his obsession with order was Nia's greatest asset. He was running down the driveway, flanked by two other neighbors who had been walking their dogs. The community witness circle was forming. It wasn't a mob. It was a wall of witnesses. They didn't scream or throw things. They simply arrived and stood witness. They inserted themselves into the equation. Mr. Alcott didn't stop until he was 3 feet from Vaughn. He was breathless, his face red, but he stood his ground. I am the property manager for this association. I have not authorized any law enforcement entry today. Who gave you the code? Vaughn, still holding Nia's arm twisted behind her back, looked at Alcott with wild eyes. Back the hell up. This is a federal arrest. Arrest for what? Alcott demanded, pulling a clipboard from under his arm as if it were a shield. That is Congresswoman Donovan. She has been on the board of this HOA for 3 years. I have her resident file right here. You are assaulting a resident, Asabai. She's a suspect, Vaughn yelled, though his grip on Nia loosened slightly as the crowd grew. There were 6 people now. 7. Phones were up. Suspect? Alcott looked at Nia, then back at Vaughn. You followed a resident through the gate. I saw the log. You didn't badge in. That is trespassing. Mr. Alcott held up the digital tablet he carried for inspections, the screen displaying the gate access log in clear high-contrast text showing Nia's vehicle entry at 5:17 p.m., followed immediately by unauthorized tailgate entry detected by the sensors. Let her go, David said from the lawn, stepping closer. We are all witnesses here. You don't have a warrant. You don't have cause. Let her go. Vaughn looked around. The suspect wasn't isolated anymore. The high crime area he had invented in his head was actually a mobilized community of affluent, legally savvy citizens. Nia felt the pressure on her arm release. Vaughn stepped back, shoving her slightly as he did so. She stumbled against her car, gasping for breath, rubbing her wrist where his fingers had dug in. "You're making a big mistake," Vaughn hissed, trying to regain control. "She fits the profile. High-end vehicle evasive maneuvers." "I was parking!" Nia shouted, finding her voice again. She moved away from him toward the garage door, stepping out of the dead zone. Her phone buzzed. The signal reconnected. She looked down. 1 bar, 2 bars. She hit the dial button again. "Marcus," she whispered as the line picked up. "Marcus, help." "Nia, I can barely hear you." Marcus's voice was tinny, breaking up. "Where you... Okay. Driveway," she gasped. "ICE agents. They grabbed me. Get Elena. Get the police." "On it," Marcus said, his voice sharpening. "Stay on the line. I'm patching Elena in." There was a click, then a burst of static. The connection was terrible. The second imperfection. "Congresswoman." It was Elena, her chief of counsel. Her voice sounded like she was underwater. "I'm DA, line, police, en route." Nia held the phone out, putting it on speaker. "Officer," she yelled at Vaughn. "My attorney is on the line." Vaughn sneered. "I can't hear a damn thing." "Put on..." The voice on the phone cut in and out. "Badge. Number..." Vaughn looked at Carter. "See, she's faking it. It's probably her boyfriend." Carter run the VIN. "If this car comes back even slightly flagged, we're taking her in regardless of the neighborhood watch." Carter looked at the crowd. He looked at Sarah on the balcony. He looked at Mr. Alcott's tablet. He looked terrified. "Vaughn," Carter whispered, "we should wait for APD. This is bad." "Run the VIN," Vaughn barked. While Carter moved to the dashboard of Nia's car, Nia focused on the phone. "Elena, can you hear me?" "Loud and clear now." A new voice cut through. It wasn't Elena. It was deeper, resonating with anger. "This is District Attorney Roberts. I am patched in via your counsel. Agent, I suggest you stop what you are doing immediately." Vaughn froze. He looked at the phone in Nia's hand. "Who is this?" Vaughn demanded. "This is the District Attorney," the voice repeated. "I have dispatched the Atlanta Police Department. They are 2 minutes out. I am currently looking at a live feed from a neighbor's security camera sent to my office by Mr. Henderson. You are operating outside your jurisdiction. You have no warrant. You have assaulted an elected official." Vaughn's face went pale. The mention of the specific camera feed David must have sent it to his contact instantly meant there was no hiding. "We have reasonable suspicion," Vaughn stammered, his bravado evaporating. "The vehicle fits. The vehicle is registered to Nia Donovan." Mr. Alcott interrupted, reading from his tablet. "I told you. It's in the system." Sirens began to wail in the distance. They were close. Fast. Vaughn looked at his car. He looked at the exit. But he was blocked in. Mr. Alcott had parked his golf cart across the driveway entrance. David was standing by the bumper. "We're leaving," Vaughn said, turning toward his sedan. "We'll sort this out at the station." "You're not going anywhere," Nia said. Her fear was hardening into a cold, diamond-sharp anger. She stepped away from her car, moving toward the open space of the driveway. "You touched me. You trespassed. You are going to wait right here." The blue lights of the Atlanta PD cruisers flashed against the brick walls, painting the scene in chaotic bursts of color. 2 cruisers pulled up to the curb tires, screeching. Officers spilled out hands on their holsters, moving with the urgency of a "officer needs assistance" call. The lead officer, a sergeant named Miller, ran up the driveway. He saw the 2 men in tactical vests. He saw the black woman standing by the luxury car. He saw the crowd of neighbors. For a terrifying second, the bias cut the other way. Miller looked at Vaughn, a white man in a vest, and then at Nia. "Ma'am, step away from the officers," Miller shouted, his hand dropping to his weapon. "No," David shouted from the lawn. "They are the aggressors. That's Congresswoman Donovan. She lives here," Sarah yelled from the balcony. "They attacked her." The confusion, the consequence of the chaotic scene lasted only a moment, but it was a dangerous moment. Vaughn smirked, thinking the cavalry had arrived for him. "Officer, these people are interfering with a federal op," Vaughn said, stepping forward. "Secure the perimeter." But Sergeant Miller paused. He looked at Nia. He recognized her. He had worked security for the MLK Day Parade she led. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Stand down," Miller ordered his officers, pointing at Vaughn. "I said stand down." Miller walked straight past Vaughn to Nia. "Congresswoman, are you injured?" "He grabbed my wrist," Nia said, holding up her arm. It was already swelling. "He twisted my arm behind my back. He refused to identify himself. He has no warrant. Miller turned slowly to face Vaughn. I need to see badges. Now. We're ICE, Vaughn said, but the swagger was gone. We're conducting... I don't care if you're the Pope, Miller snapped. You're in my sector assaulting a federal representative. Let me see the badges. Vaughn slowly reached into his pocket. He pulled out his wallet and flipped it open. Miller took it. He looked at the badge, then at Vaughn. He pulled his radio mic. Dispatch, this is Sergeant Miller. I have 2 federal agents on scene at Millstone. Run names Vaughn Roman, Carter Lewis. Check for active ops in this grid. The radio crackled. Silence stretched for 10 long seconds. Then the dispatcher's voice returned, tinny but audible to everyone. Negative, Sergeant. No active ICE ops in that sector. Field office reports those agents checked out for administrative duties at 1400 hours. They are off the board. Off the board? Freelancing. The color drained from Carter's face. Vaughn told me we had a tip, he muttered. He said, shut up, Vaughn hissed. You're done, Miller said. He didn't arrest them immediately. Jurisdiction was messy, but he did something more effective. Hand over your weapons, both of you, for officer safety. Vaughn hesitated. Miller's hand went to his own holster. Now, slowly, painfully, Roman Vaughn unclipped his holster. He handed it to Miller. It was a complete castration of his authority. He stood there stripped of his gun, his badge in Miller's pocket, surrounded by the neighbors he had dismissed. The next 40 minutes were a lesson in institutional backbone. A supervisor from the local ICE field office arrived summoned by the DA. He was a harried-looking man who took one look at Nia, one look at the bruising on her wrist, and one look at the neighbors with their phones and knew his career was hanging by a thread. He formally apologized to Nia in the driveway. He took custody of Vaughn and Carter. He initiated the internal review protocol right there on the sidewalk, suspending them pending investigation. Nia stood by her car throughout it all. She refused to sit. She refused water. She answered the police questions with short factual sentences. Why didn't you just leave the car? The ICE supervisor asked gently, trying to understand the escalation. Because my groceries are in the trunk, Nia said, her voice flat. And because if I had run into my house, you would have said I was fleeing. And if I had backed out, you would have said I was assaulting an officer with a deadly weapon. I stayed because I had no choice. The supervisor looked at the ground. He had no answer for that. When the cars finally cleared out, the police taking statements, the ICE agents driven away in the back of the supervisor's SUV, like naughty children, the silence returned to Millstone Street. Mr. Alcott walked up to Nia. He looked at her wrist. I'll email you the gate logs tonight, Mrs. Donovan, for your records. Thank you, Mr. Alcott, Nia said. And I'll send the video to your office, Sarah called down from the balcony. Her voice was softer now. I got the whole thing. Thanks, Sarah, Nia said. She turned to David. The older man was picking up his garden hose. You didn't have to stay, David, Nia said quietly. David looked at her. He adjusted his glasses. Yes, I did. You know I did. He didn't say anything else. He just turned the water back on and went back to his hydrangeas. Nia walked to the back of her SUV. She opened the trunk. The heat hit her face. She reached into the bag and pulled out the pint of mint chocolate chip ice cream. It was soft, squishy to the touch. Ruined. She stared at it for a long moment. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer exhaustion of having to be unbreakable. She had won. She had the badge numbers. She had the video. She had the witnesses. Vaughn would lose his job. But the ice cream was melted. The sanctity of her driveway was violated. And for a few seconds, a man had held her life in his hands simply because he didn't like the car she drove. She walked into her house, locking the door behind her with a heavy thud. She placed the melted ice cream in the sink. She leaned against the counter, her hands shaking so hard she had to grip the granite to steady herself. 3 days later, the press conference was not held at a podium in D.C., but right there in the driveway. Nia stood before a bank of microphones, her wrist wrapped in a compression bandage, a visual testament that the media could not ignore. Behind her stood David Sarah and Mr. Alcott. We are told to comply, Nia said, her voice ringing out clear and strong for the cameras. We are told that if we just follow orders, we will be safe. I followed orders. I identified myself. I stayed in my vehicle. And I was assaulted in my own home by men who saw a suspect instead of a citizen. She paused, looking directly into the lens of the main camera. We are not asking for an apology. We have received that. We are demanding structural change. As of this morning, the department has agreed to a complete audit of all plainclothes task force operations in this district. They are implementing a mandatory, reasonable suspicion documentation protocol that requires supervisor approval before a stop is initiated based on vehicle profiles. The payoff was real. Vaughn was fired 2 weeks later, his pension stripped. Carter was demoted and placed on permanent desk duty. The policy Nia drafted, the driveway doctrine, became a template for prohibiting warrantless stops on private residential property without exigent circumstances. But the real victory wasn't the policy. It was the neighborhood. A week later, Nia drove through the gate. She waved at the camera. As she pulled up the hill, she saw David. He waved. Sarah was on her balcony. She waved. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a line of defense. They were the proof that when the system tries to isolate you, the only answer is to refuse to be alone. This story illustrates the terrifying speed at which a consensual encounter can escalate into a rights violation when bias is involved. Nia's survival was not guaranteed by her status as a congresswoman, but by the immediate visible presence of witnesses who refused to leave. The attitude trap is a common tactic used to manufacture cause for arrest. By remaining factual and refusing to be baited, Nia forced the agents to rely on legal grounds they didn't have. Practical takeaways. First, if you are stopped on your own property, explicitly state that you do not consent to a search and ask, "Am I free to go inside?" to establish the legal nature of the detention. Next, if you are a bystander, your most powerful tool is visibility. Stand at a safe distance, hold your phone horizontally, and narrate the time and location to create an undeniable record. Third, understand that freelancing agents often rely on isolation. Calling a verified dispatch number or a lawyer immediately creates an institutional backbone that strips away their anonymity. Fourth, document the aftermath, immediately names of neighbors, badge numbers, license plates, because memories fade, but written logs and video timestamps do not. Finally, recognize that safety is communal. Knowing your neighbors and looking out for one another is the most effective form of security system you can have. Some elements are selectively fictionalized for education.